Three, two, one. Welcome back, students. This is part 2 of Basics of Receptor Pharmacology. If you were feeling a little overwhelmed by the first lecture, it's understandable. This is complicated stuff. This one may be a little more challenging, but I encourage you to revisit this perhaps more than once to try and really get these concepts down. And you will be learning and relearning this through your whole career. So try and get the first couple layers of paint down here. And if you're wondering what this is behind me, I'll tell you it's not a tuba. But if you can tell me what it is, shoot me an email. All right, so this talk, we're going to talk about the different types of receptor activity and the concept of stickiness or dissociation constant, or Ki, to talk about how a drug attaches to a receptor, not attacks, attaches, and to understand the difference between fast and slow action at a receptor. We're going to talk about the differences between agonism, antagonism, and reverse agonism, and why that stickiness of the receptor matters, and what the receptor does when it's either activated or antagonized. Now, we alluded to this in the last talk. This is the differences between agonism, partial agonism, antagonism, and inverse agonism. So in the case of full agonism, you have a full, the receptor, whatever it does is turned on fully. With partial agonism, it's like a dimmer switch. So it's only turned on partially. With antagonism, the receptor is blocked. So the drug or the neurotransmitter cannot get to the receptor. In partial antagonism, you have it's sort of like the inverse of the dimmer switch. And in inverse agonism, which is probably the most abstract concept to understand here, you're actually running the system in reverse here. So the closest I could come up with this with electricity was that, you know, if you have a solar panel system on your house, if you're actually generating enough electricity, you're feeding that back into the grid rather than taking electricity off the grid, you're adding electricity to the grid. So that's sort of the concept of an inverse agonism on a receptor. Another way you can look at this is a speedometer. So one thing to remember is that neurons have what they call a basal firing rate. And so it's not like the neuron is just turned off and waiting to be switched on. It's always sending a signal. So it might be like boop, 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 firing, right? If there's a full agonist attached, it's going to get going really fast. So it's going to start going from that basal boop, 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 boop. And a partial agonist is going to do a lesser version of that. So somewhere between full agonism and its basal normal firing rate. An antagonist is actually going to turn it way down or off, okay? And an inverse agonist is going to put that in reverse or put it in fully off position. So I recognize this is a pretty abstract concept and a little difficult to understand, but we can certainly go over this in our discussion sections. Another concept to understand is the idea of an inhibitory constant 50. So what this is the amount of drug it takes to inhibit a biological process, say for example, the reuptake of serotonin at the synapse by 50%. So how much do you need to do that? And this is something that is commonly used in drug studies. Another concept, which is maybe even more important, is the inhibitory constant, or Ki is what this is called, or dissociative constant. And what you'll see this in drug monographs. I'm going to have you do an assignment where you look that up. And the thing to understand is that the lower the number is, the lower the Ki, the more sticky that drug is on that receptor. And a more sticky drug, so that is one that has a lower Ki, is actually more attracted to that receptor than one with a higher drug. And you can use this to your advantage in competitive binding. So for example, you're all familiar with naloxone or Narcan. That has a lower Ki for the mu opiate receptor than morphine. So when it comes along, it says, hey, morphine, get out of my way. I'm sitting here. Okay, and it blocks morphine from reoccupying that receptor, which is what reduces an overdose. And of course, a drug that has a lower Ki is more potent than one that has a very high Ki, that you need a lot of molecules just in order to get a few of them to stick in place. If your molecules are very sticky, like say something like fentanyl, you don't need many of those molecules to bind to those receptors. Way of thinking about this is the difference between a lazy boy chair and those lousy bus stop seats that they have. So something that has a low Ki comes there, it settles in, and it's not leaving, right? It's not ready to get off that receptor if that receptor is the chair. Whereas something with a low binding affinity or high Ki, it just makes this quick drive-by, it sits down for a minute, the bus comes, it gets back up, it leaves. Okay, so this would be an example. This would be quetiapine or Seroquel at the D2 receptor, whereas Haldol is much stickier and sits on that receptor and doesn't like to get up and leave. Now, you can use this to understand a drug, how a drug works at the receptors. Now, I'm going to have you pause this in a second, but I want you to get oriented. So the first thing we're going to look at is the left-hand side. These are different serotonin receptors. So 5-HT refers to serotonin. So you've got serotonin 3, 7, 1D. SERT refers to the serotonin transporter. So get familiar with that. Pause if you need to. Then moving to the right, we'll see what the drug, in this case, vortioxetine or Trintellix, does at that receptor site, whether it's an antagonist, a partial agonist, or an inhibitor, which is what those abbreviations mean. Now, if we look at the Ki, which is the next column to the right, you can see what vortioxetine does at those different receptors. And you can see where it's most sticky is at the serotonin transporter, which makes sense because this is essentially a fancy SSRI. It also inhibits the activity at the 50% inhibition, and you can take a look at that by going over further to the right. So it's most inhibitory, again, not surprising, to the serotonin transporter. So we can use this information to start to understand how a drug works and also to predict where it might have side effects. Now, I'm going to have you do an example like this using information from the prescribing data. And we can take a look at this and look at, say, something like haloperidol. And going across here, we can see at the D2 receptor, which is a dopamine 2 receptor, it has a potency of 1.2. Now, if we compare that to quetiapine, quetiapine's Ki at the same receptor is 310. So it's many orders of magnitude higher, which means that it's less sticky, because remember, the numbers are inverted. So smaller numbers mean more sticky. So quetiapine is going to make a quick drive-by and then hop off that receptor, whereas haloperidol is going to sit there for a while. Now, I mentioned we can use this to predict side effects. So let's take a look at the acetylcholine muscarinic receptor. That's what ACHM stands for. So this is with regards to anticholinergic side effects. And this time, let's compare haloperidol, which has very little anticholinergic side effects. In fact, it has so few that we actually usually give it with an anticholinergic, like cogentin, but we'll get to that when we talk about antipsychotics. But it has very little, it has a Ki of almost 5,000. Whereas you compare that to something like clozapine, which has a Ki of 34 at the cholinergic receptor, the acetylcholine receptor. So clozapine has a lot of anticholinergic side effects. We can predict that from looking at this chart here. Okay, similar for histamine receptors. Now, with histamine receptors, you're going to have a lot of sedation, and we can see some of the most sedating medications, such as olanzapine and clozapine, have a high affinity for the H1 or histamine receptor in the brain, which is why they make us tired. So I'm going to have you go ahead and stop the slideshow, and I want you to go and Google, think of a drug that you use. It's preferable to use a more contemporary drug because you'll find more information. Say vortioxetine, and specifically the words prescribing information. And what you should find is the FDA label for that drug. It's going to be lots of fine print, and you want to go to section 12 and look at the binding affinities of the drug. And we're going to be using that information for an exercise later. But you can go ahead and apply this information now and stop this presentation. Okay, now that you're back, another way of looking at these is visually. So if you're a fan of using Stephen Stahl's text, he draws these little cartoons in which there's the molecule, which is the sphere, but all these little arms sticking off of it represent different receptor activity affinities. So the larger it is, the more affinity it has for that receptor. So you can tell from this, just looking at, say, a tricyclic antidepressant, which are known for having a lot of side effects, because they hit so many other receptors. So they're hitting the H1 receptor, they're hitting the muscarinic receptor, they're hitting the alpha-1 receptor, which is going to cause all sorts of side effects, in addition to inhibiting the serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake process. Now, if we move to paroxetine, which is a more recent SSRI, mostly working on serotonin and norepinephrine, but also has some of these anticholinergic muscarinic side effects. And compare that to a much more recent antidepressant such as escitalopram, which is pretty much a pure serotonin transport inhibitor. So this has the fewest side effects. So this is a kind of a visual schematic that Stahl likes to use. Another thing to understand in pharmacology is the idea of an enantiomer. So an enantiomer is essentially, think of this as like mirror images of a molecule. So just like my right hand and my left hand are not identical, I cannot put my right hand in a left-handed glove because they're mirror images of each other. You can have the same thing in chemistry. So in chemistry, when a right-handed, which is sometimes referred to as the R side of the molecule, and the left-handed, or the S side, so this comes from the Latin sinistra, and right is dextro, okay? So when you put those two things together in one mix, we call that racemic. If you just do one side, it's called an enantiomer. And sometimes this is used in the reference of the drug name. So escitalopram is actually just the left-handed molecule of racemic citalopram. So they took the R citalopram out, just left you with the left S citalopram. So this when you see these abbreviations, that's what they're referring to. Now, what does the receptor do once it's activated? Well, it depends what kind of receptor it is. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Now, some things can happen very fast. These are usually ionotropic channels. So essentially the receptor is also a channel for positively or negatively charged ions, such as sodium, to flow into the neuron. We'll talk about that in a moment. And that causes a change in the resting potential of the neuron and usually causes a very quick effect to the activity of the cell. You can also have these ligand, these other linked receptors, such as, I'm not going to get too much into the tyrosine kinase linked receptors because they are not as important in psychiatry, but G-coupled protein receptors, which are also called metabotropic receptors, are very important because what this is doing is essentially it's setting off a chain of events, and I'll describe that in more detail in a moment, which has a later downstream cellular effect. A good example of this would be a lot of our antidepressants. And then finally, things that cause change to the cell nucleus and cause cellular growth. And this is a very slow process, such as in estrogen receptors. So those are ligand activated transcription factors. Okay, so these are the two that we mostly focus on in psychiatry, frankly, is the ionotropic and the metabotropic, or G protein coupled receptors. So let's just go back to our basic neurophysiology and remember how this works. So so remember, inside the cell and outside the cell, there is a difference in the electrical charge. So inside the cell is more negatively charged than the outside of the cell. There are more positively charged ions floating around outside of the cell. Okay, so when those flow in, the cell can then depolarize and fire. Okay, that's what depolarization is. You can see if you look at that cartoon of the voltage differences. Okay. Now, this gets a little bit complicated and a little daunting sometimes when I see images like this, but essentially those are your ion channels. They are allowing positively charged, in this case, sodium and potassium, to flow into the cell. Okay, when that happens, you get this increase in the resting membrane voltage, the voltage inside the cell, and eventually it will fire. Okay, and it will send the signal down the line to the next neurons in the pathway. Okay, so there's that ionotropic channel that's sort of waiting there to be opened up. And usually a neurotransmitter will cause that to open up. And because there's more of these positively charged ions outside the cell than inside the cell, those ions will flow into the cell from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration down what we call the concentration gradient, causing it to fire. Now, how does this apply to psychopharmacology? A number of different receptors are they are inotropic channels. So a good example of this would be GABA receptors, which is relevant to benzodiazepines. So they allow for negatively charged ions to flow in. So normally, if a channel allows positively charged ions to flow in, when they open up, those positively charged ions flow in, and the neuron fires. Okay, that's the depolarization or action potential. Okay, now let's say we plug in a benzodiazepine, which actually allows now through that GABA A receptor more negatively charged ions to flow in. So those negatively charged ions are going to hyperpolarize the cell. They're going to make it less likely to fire. And that's an inhibitory effect on the neuron. Okay, so you can start to see why that might be useful in, say, anxiety, or if you're using a benzodiazepine for sedation. Decreasing the net amount of activity might have that sedating effect, for example. Okay, so this is the inhibiting of that neuron from firing. Now, I'm not going to get into this in excruciating detail because it's sort of beyond the scope of this class, but I want you to understand this, and this is available this is from Stephen Stahl's book, but this is the idea of a G protein coupled receptor. So the receptor at the very top there is activated. That causes essentially this cascade of events, which I'm not going to get into the minutia of this here, but what you're seeing is, so on that black line is the inside outside of the cell. So above it is outside the cell, that's the neuronal membrane. Everything below it is inside the cell. So now we've got all these, what they call second messengers. So this is sort of like the game of telephone. It's saying, hey, we got this message, passing it on, passing it down, and it goes through all these different steps. By the way, all of these could potentially be pharmacologic targets to remember too. So we're going through all these different steps, passing the message down until finally it gets to the nucleus and it begins to activate the growth of that cell. Okay, so final bottom line is what happens? We change the transcription of messenger RNA and we change the expression of that cell. And in this case, we're causing a growth of the cell. This is a photomicrograph of a neuron starting to make little buds, little dendritic buds where it's reaching out to its neighboring neurons. That is cellular growth. Or if you like cartoons, this is why the idea of a chemical imbalance is actually really incorrect thinking. So, or put differently, why does it take 4 or 5 weeks for an antidepressant to work? The bottom line is downstream effects. It's that when these G protein coupled receptors are activated on the surface of the cell by the neurotransmitters, which are now available in larger amounts because, say, we've inhibited the serotonin reuptake transport pump, we're going to see these second and third messengers, which are going to eventually release something called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You can think of it as neuronal fertilizer, which is why I have this little poop icon, right? So we're already now 3 steps down the line. That BDNF is going to encourage this neuron to grow. It's going to change the genetic expression of the DNA in the cell nucleus, and that's going to lead to this increased neuronal growth, which we see here again in that rat neuron. So this is before and this is after. And this is what we think may have that downstream antidepressant effect. But this is a very slow and complicated process because of this. So in summary, I just want you to take home the idea that the effect of the drug is a cause of the drug acting on the receptors of the cell or causing the neurotransmitters to work differently. And that a lot of times we have these receptors in other parts of our body too. So for example, we have serotonin receptors largely in our gut, even though we think of it mostly as relevant to our brain, but we have them in our gut as well. And because they are in our gut, the same increase in serotonin that, say, a drug like sertraline causes in the brain also increases it in the gut. That serotonin in the gut increases transit time or decreases transit time. So this is why we can have a side effect of diarrhea, for example. And finally, the speed at which the drug impacts a cell will determine how fast those effects take place. And in many of our drug classes, such as antidepressants, those changes are quite slow to take effect. So I hope this helps, and we can always talk about it in our discussion sessions. Thank you.